I see I didn't scare off too many of you from last week, so that is good news. And I've got all my gadgets this week, so now I get to wander a little bit more. So I will enjoy that, I'm sure. So we're going to start off by seeing previously what happened on last week's episode. I know, we have to do a recap. So what we discovered last week was by looking at a bunch of facts and figures, we discovered that Christianity is shrinking in the United States, that right now only about 64% of the population in the United States will decide to correspond to being a Christian of some sort in the Christian faith, some faith group within the Christian faith. And so we found that. And the next thing we found is that the number of the non-religious affiliated is growing. So it has grown to almost 1/3 of the country now. We call them the nuns, and that is because of their no religious affiliation. That is the group that includes atheism, it includes agnosticism, it includes people who have just switched out. Curtis this morning was talking about people who are deconstructing out of the church, and it includes those people. Those would be what this survey would have called switchers. They were once aligned with Christianity in some way, shape, or form, and they have switched out of Christianity. And so that number is growing. And then we asked the question, why is that happening? And is it because are we doing what we're supposed to be doing? Are we the church that God was looking for and that God wanted? And do we resemble that church? Do we resemble the church that we read about in the Bible? Do we resemble the Jesus that people read about in the Bible? And I told you that one of the things that I think is leading to this is that because people are not seeing Jesus when they look at the church, they are not finding any benefit to being part of the church. And I propose this. I propose that if people cannot see Jesus in the church, we need to figure out a way to become Jesus so that they can see him in the church here in the United States. All right, so before we get started, what questions do you have about last week? All right, that's good. So let's roll right into it. So guess what? You get to participate once again. This time around your table, what I would like you to do is I would like you to talk about two different questions. I would like you to talk around the table about your conversion story, or what brought you to the church. How did you become a follower of Christ? And then I would like you to discuss amongst your table why you stay a part of the church. Why do you stay being a follower of Christ? All right, so I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. And ready, go. I saw some great conversations going on. Thank you very much for playing along yet again this week. So appreciate all of the good discussion that you had. So before we jump back into this, okay, this is the continuing disclaimer from last week. I'm just going to tell you, I don't claim to have all the answers here. I've tried to noodle through this over the last few years and been thinking about it and have not come up with all the answers for you for this. So just as last week when we were defining the problem, really what the purpose that I hope that we will do is that it will stimulate some thought, some discussion, and spur you into action of being prayerful about this, and for you to think through some of this and to come up with this. But I do have maybe some suggestions and some things that will help with that. So once again, these are thoughts that I've had after reading a book called Church Reset by Jack Wilkie. That kind of started me on this path. I read a couple of other books in there as well. and have just kind of been praying on this and thinking about this for a long time. All right. So, by show of hands in the room, how many of you are here today because somebody took time to talk to you about Jesus? Okay. All right. So, yes, good. All right. So there were a fair number of hands that went up, and that's good. I mean, that's how we would expect this would work, is that somebody would talk to somebody about Jesus. That would start a journey, and so that journey would allow you to mature and would allow you to grow as a Christian, and so that's a good thing. How many of you in this room are more like me and grew up in the church and was at the church every time the doors were open, and you have always gone to church and you continue to go to church and have never known anything else but going to church? How many of you are like that? All right, yes. So I would figure in a crowd like this that is stuck around after services that there would be a bunch of hands that would go up, and that you are the likely audience for that kind of an answer. All right. I will tell you, I always thought, my story was kind of boring. I've had friends that have had great conversion stories, And I always wanted to make up, like a great story, like, I was trapped in a dungeon and I was talking to a guy through the wall with a cup, and he was telling me about Jesus, and I was like, I want to be a Christian, but it's not my story. My story is the same as many of you here. At some point, I made a decision, and I can remember when that was. I was in the 6th grade. I was about 12 years old. I made the decision to turn my life over to God, and that was, how it all started. It didn't mean that I was, mega Christian then. Not that I'm mega Christian now, but at least it started my journey, and I began to grow from that point. But there may be some of you here that do have a conversion story kind of like that, where you were trapped in a dungeon or maybe somewhere, and someone reached out to you. And those kind of crazy conversion stories are really exciting. And, I've told my friends that have some of those stories, I was really jealous of them. I wanted to have a story like that myself. So, all right. So, the question that is before us is, what can we do about the shrinking Christian majority that is here in this country and really all around the world, even though it's really not all around the world when you think about it, okay? Because when you look at where the numbers are really falling amongst Christians, it's not in the 3rd world, and it's not in the 4th world, and it's not in the 5th world. It's in the industrialized nations. It's in what we would say civilized society. That's where where we're actually losing the majority of our people. In fact, in some of those other countries, we just have to look at like some of our mission reports that we get where Christianity is growing. Their numbers are growing significantly within some of those countries. But when we look at what is happening with this, I'd like to make another proposal to you. If people are not seeing Jesus in the church, and this is why people are not joining the church, because they don't see in us Jesus, what is it that they see? So here's what I kind of think. What I kind of think is that instead of seeing a church, what people see is a business of steam. Can you see that? No. Okay, that's good. I got to get rid of this. All right. Instead of seeing Jesus, what they see is a business, and they see a business model. Now, think about what businesses are in business for, all right? What is the purpose of a business? The purpose of a business is to get people in the doors. The purpose of a business is to sell something, and the purpose of the business is to make sure that when people are leaving their store, they have something in their hand, right? Or if you think about an online business, the whole idea of an online business is to get people to just view stuff, to look at things, right? They need to look at my stuff, and that's the business. Unfortunately, because we have a business, the church has kind of adopted a business-like model, right? So in any business type thing, there are two basic categories of people. There is the provider. That's the business person that has something to provide. And so we make sure, even within the church, just like the products and services that a business wants to sell inside the church, we want to make sure we have the right products and services to sell. So what we put together is we make sure we select the right kinds of worship. We make sure that we have good sermons, okay? We make sure that we have the right programs that are out there that people can work on if they like to do that. And then business churches even go deeper. They want to figure out the right formula, right? How many songs are we going to sing, to how many prayers we're going to do, and how long the sermon has to be, right? Okay, so we may need to talk to you later, Curtis, about that. How long the sermon has to be, right? And even down to what types of songs are we going to sing? Are we going to sing new songs? Are we going to sing old songs? Are we going to sing a mix of the songs? What are we going to do? We have to figure out what the magic formula is in order to fill the pews, right? Because the end goal is, just like in any business, we want to get people into our business, right? That's the goal, is getting people into the business. Now, on the opposite side of the provider, there is the consumer, right? And so the consumer, they want to take advantage of whatever it is that the business has to offer, right? And so just like any consumer in a normal business, they would weigh their options. Okay, if you want to buy a car, you look at all the different cars that you want to consider. You look at all the features, you look at all the bells and all the whistles, and then you make your decision. Which car is it that I'm going to buy? All right? Just like that, consumers in the church world now will look at different churches, and they will decide, what does this church have to offer me? So I go shopping, I take my menu, and I start flipping through the menu with all the different churches on it, and I figure out, okay, this is what I want. I want a little of this, and I want a little of that. And they're looking at things like, how much will I have to get involved? Can I just show up? Or will I going to have to do something if I come to this church? And really, it comes down to what's in it for me, right? So when I come to the church building, what's in it for me when I get to the church building? All right, so for many of us in this room, the church business model seems kind of normal, right? We have, some churches I've been to, we even had things like church business meetings, right? And we would sit at the church business meeting and we would figure out all the different things that we just talked about, right? Because that was what we were looking for. In fact, I can remember one church I went to at one point, we were figuring out how we could pay somebody to walk around the neighborhood and evangelize because nobody wanted to do it in the church. So we were going to pay somebody to do it. That was what the business we were going to talk about that day. So that seems kind of backwards to me when you think about that. But that's where we're at. It seems normal to us because for many, many years, this is the way that churches have been run, right? And so you may have grown up in a church like that. You may have never seen anything different than a church environment that looks like that. But when we think about that, what we really need to look at is, what was Jesus' model? Okay? What is it that Jesus wanted in the church? So if you want to turn with me to John chapter 6, let's talk about the feeding of the 5,000. So it's in John chapter 6, starting in verse 8, and we're going to look at verses 8 through 13. And here's how it reads. Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many? Jesus said, have the people sit down. There was plenty of grass in that place, and the men sat down, about 5,000 of them. And Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, gather the pieces that are left over, and let nothing be wasted. So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. All right, so have you ever put yourself in that group of 5,000? after you saw this? Okay. It would be, definitely, would you want to be part of something like that? Is that something that you would like to look at and be a part of? Surely this is the way we should build the church, right? We should get them in the building and we should take 5 barley loaves and 5 fish and we should feed everybody in our building and then collect up all the leftovers, right? That would be the way to do it. Jesus is looking at this. He's definitely at this point, he's got the meat in the seat. He's got you in the pew, right? This is Jesus working right now, and he's got all that. So, when Jesus began to leave, the crowd, they all got up to follow him, right? So Jesus has them. He has them. So what does he do? Well, let's take a look. Let's look at verse 16. Okay? Or 15. He walks away. Verse 15 says, Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. All right? Well, that doesn't seem like that's the way to build a church. All right? So, what else did Jesus do? Well, let's look at verse 26. Jesus tells them straight to their faces in verse 26, Jesus answered, I tell you the truth, you are looking for me not because you saw miraculous signs, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill. Okay, well, that sounds kind of chastising. If I was part of that crowd and I was in Jesus' camp right then, and he's kind of telling me that I'm really not part of who he wants to have there, that doesn't sound like a way to build a church. And then, what does he do? Down in verse 51. In verse 51, he gives them this teaching. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. All right, so here's a bunch of people that he's telling, okay, what you're really going to have to do is you're going to have to eat me, right? That seems kind of gross. And it's a really tough teaching. That doesn't really seem like a way to keep a crowd around either. Right? So what's the end result? Well, look in verse 66. In verse 66 it says, from this time many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. Okay. So he had over 5,000 people in verse 13, and by verse 66 of the same chapter, he had already driven off the majority of the people that were there with him. So, did he go chasing after them? Was that the next thing that he did? No, the next thing that happens is his disciples talk to him about it and say, what are you doing? We're trying to get people to follow us, and you just sent them all away. And his question to them is, are you going to stick around? He's not chasing after them. His model didn't involve figuring out what they needed. His model involved figuring out what he had to give. And he knew that if they couldn't accept him as Lord, it didn't matter how dedicated they were to following him around, they were there for the wrong reasons. That's why the people he ended up with are the people that were willing to drop everything to follow him. He wanted truly committed people, disciples that were ready to follow him. Okay, now, if this business model church is not the church that Jesus wanted, then what was the church supposed to look like? Well, let's turn to Ephesians and look at Ephesians 4. And this gives us a little bit of an idea. All right, so starting in verse 11, Ephesians 4 says, it was he who gave some to be apostles, some to be prophets, some to be evangelists, and some to be pastors and teachers, to prepare God's people for works of service so that the body of Christ may be built up until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. All right? Okay, so in this chapter in Ephesians, Paul is talking to the Ephesian people, and he's really telling them, he's really kind of urged them on to right living. He's telling them this is the way to live right. And in this chapter, he begins to tell them how they're all going to depend on each other in their lives and how they're going to do what they need to do. And then he throws this piece in here about how the church is supposed to be assembled. All right, now, depending on your views, all right, I know there are competing thoughts with this. Apostles and prophets, that's something that I'm just going to tell you, I'm going to gloss over it. This is not the apostles and prophets you are looking for. Apostles, in my opinion, he's talking about the 12 that were sent out when Jesus was gone, and those are the apostles that they're talking about. And the prophets that are mentioned here, in my opinion, so I'm willing to be wrong on all of this, but because I don't want to really get into big debate about it today, I think prophecy stopped when the Bible was all put together and everybody had what they needed to do, okay? Those are my personal thoughts, but it's really not germane to what I want to talk about, which is the next three sets of people that it talks about in this verse, because the next portion of this says that Jesus gave us evangelists. Right? So the evangelists that Paul is talking about here is he's talking about the preachers. He's talking about the people that are there to give out God's word and that are to give the word of God to the people. And then the next part, it says that there are pastors or elders that were put in place to guide the church, to be the leadership of our church, to make sure the church is moving forward and who are doing those kinds of works. And then the last set of people that Paul talks about here is he talks about the teachers. And the teachers are the people who are here to try to explain the things better to us so that we can understand better. Because sometimes Curtis uses big words, and so the teachers have to break it down into smaller words, right? So that's the idea here, is that there are evangelists, there are pastors, there are teachers. They are all working in the church. And this is a great start to a church, right? In order to have some kind of an organization, which we do need to be organized, there needs to be church leadership, right? Now the question becomes, why do we have church leadership? And that's in the next part of this passage. It says that the church leadership is there in order to equip his people for works of service so that the body of Christ may be built up. So although these positions exist in the church, their main purpose is not to do all the work. Their main purpose is to prepare us to do the work. That's the way this is supposed to work, is that when we build a church, they prepare us, and we get to work. So instead of a business, what it sounds more like to me is, once again, going back to last week, is it sounds more like a family-type environment, right? Where we have family members, and these family members get trained, and through training, they train others, and through that training, they go out and... Okay, so you get the idea. It all flows, right? Everybody is working. Everybody is doing the kingdom work. Okay. Does that mean we don't need the leaders? No, we still need the church leaders because we still need elders to keep us on track. We still need evangelists to preach the word to us, to give us things to think about as we go out to do the work. And we still need teachers to break that all down for us in order to make sure that we're doing the right things. So, the other part of it is that if we just rely on the leaders to do all this work, they can't physically touch all the people that all of us in this room could touch. The reach of the church is so much greater than just the people that are in the church leadership. We all need to get busy because there's way more people than they can actually touch. Okay, So here's like an analogy for you, right? So the church leadership is like the ignition on a car, right? Whether it's a push button or whether it's a twist key or whether it's a crank, depending on what era you are from, you turn on the ignition and you use it for about 3 seconds, and then you're no longer using the ignition. The car is running, right? That's the way this church model is supposed to work. The leaders are supposed to ignite us, and then we get busy and the church gets to work, right? And it's self-sustaining, and we all are working together. All right, now, think about your discussion at your table when you talked about your story about how you came to be a follower of Christ. I hope that that was an exciting story for you to tell. I hope that it was something that made you happy when you told it, that it brings you joy, and I hope that it was an easy story for you to tell. At a minimum, all of us in this room need to be able to tell that story, because if we can't tell that story about how we became a follower of Christ, if we can't explain to others of why we are excited to be a part of the church, if we can't show Jesus to other people by doing that, then we've got kind of a problem, right? You can't give something to somebody and show them how badly they need it if you can't show it how badly you need it yourself. And that's where it starts. It all starts with that one little story of how you became a Christian. All right, now, it's very daunting, okay? This whole idea of talking to people. First of all, who do you talk to? I mean, do you just walk up to people on the streets? I went to a youth rally when I was I must have been probably early high school, and we went to this youth rally in Denver. It was called Jesus Rocky Mountain. And so what they were going to do is they were going to put us all in a bus, and they were going to bus us to downtown Denver, and we were going to stand on the street corners. And we went down there, and man, I'll just tell you, it was scary. It was scary. So first of all, not a lot of people stopped to talk to us, all right? So even just finding the right people to talk to is very daunting, right? And so that's one of the things that we kind of have to figure out too, is how we're going to do that. And I don't have that figured out, to tell you the truth, okay? But I do know that we need to have that story ready, because this gets to the idea of how Jesus built the church, okay? Jesus wanted disciples, and so he made disciples. And guess what those disciples did? They went out and they made more disciples. And then guess what those disciples did? They went out and they made more disciples, okay? I could go all the way to the wall, but I won't, all right? But you see how the cycle goes, right? We start with the leadership, because we don't have Jesus anymore, but we do have the church leadership that he gave us, and we need to be building disciples. And the disciples need to be people that are not looking to be fed at a certain point, but they are looking for ways that they can go feed others. They need to be looking for ways that they can get out to make more disciples, to bring more people in, always working towards that goal, to becoming mature, okay? Whatever that means. At some point, I'm supposed to be mature. Angie tells me that probably will never happen, but at some point, I'm supposed to become mature, and so that is the goal of what we're trying to do with the church, right? It's a lot more than just putting on our happy little Jesus coat and coming and sitting in the pews for a couple hours on Sunday morning, right? And then as soon as church is over, we take it off and we hop in our car and we're off, and then we don't think about it again until the next week when we put on our happy little Jesus coat and we come to church, right? That's not the idea of when we're building this church. Church happens outside of these walls. It happens in everybody's life, and it happens outside of our regularly appointed times, right? That's where life happens, and that's where the disciples need to be working with each other. And so, if we begin to share with each other in our own lives, it branches out, right? So discipling is not just us working with each other to try to bring each other to maturity, but we also need to be looking for opportunities for those that are lost in the world. and we need to offer them the opportunity to become a disciple as well. And we need to start with that. And some of the best ways that you can do that is starting with your own story of why this is important to me. All right. Now, I know what you're saying. Now what you want from me is you want the recipe. You want the 3 secrets of doing discipling, right? So you're all asking, Pat, can you tell me what it would take for us to do this discipling? And the answer is no. All right. I cannot give you any easy steps because, like I said, to me, this is a little bit more complicated, right? I mean, when you think about this idea of first of all, figuring out how we're going to work together, right? There is a lot of momentum built up against what we should be doing, right? This momentum, and part of this is just cultural, right? So when you think about this idea of individualism and all that kind of thing, all of these things have built up over time, and so there's a lot of momentum against us. So I will tell you this. As I've thought through this, there are some things that we should be doing and that we should be doing better. All right? What we need to do is we need to act like Jesus, right? So the first thing that we need to think about doing that Jesus did is we need to put ourselves in God's hands. So just like Jesus did, he turned everything over to God, right? In order for us to do this, we have to become so intimately familiar with Jesus that we know what that looks like and what that means to do that. And that I don't know if that scares you, but it scares me to think about that. Is that becoming so intimately familiar with Jesus that we can be able to just talk about him at any time and to show others Jesus in everything that we do, that seems kind of scary. So this is why we have to turn it over to God. And part of doing that is we need to pray about it and we need to study about it, right? So Jesus was a great example of prayer, right? But Jesus knew everything. We got to study a little bit more than Jesus did, right? So it takes that. So even though we don't know who we should be talking to, in a lot of instances, God knows who we should be talking to. And so that should be part of our prayers. This is part of that, is that God will provide us opportunities to share the idea of the church and Jesus with other people. And God will do that. I mean, I know in my life there have been times when I've been given opportunities. Some of them I've done okay with, but I can tell you the ones that I probably remember the most are the ones where I didn't. Either I ignored it, or I just either didn't see the opportunity when it happened, or I just woofed it, right? But that happens. God will put people in front of us to plant seeds when we are serious about this and we become serious about doing that. And that takes a lot of prayer to do that. But it also takes a lot of love, right? So I will tell you that this one area, this idea of us becoming a loving church and loving like Jesus, is probably the single most important aspect of this whole thing where we can make an impact on the world around us. We need to have love for each other. We need to have love for those around us who are wandering around lost and they just don't know it. And that becomes very, very difficult for us, because what that means is that we need to love the undesirables. We need to love the people that are toughest to love. And that is really a big task when you think about that. But I'm telling you that those are the people that are looking at the current church and they are telling themselves they don't see any difference in the church than the world around them. And so they don't see any reason that they need to be part of this thing. So there are definitely specific things in our love that we can do. First of all, we need to show the grace of Jesus. We need to show grace through our interactions with each other And we need to show grace to the world as well. Nothing turns an unbeliever off more quickly than when they see Christians that are arguing about petty little squabbles, okay? This is a problem with Christianity writ large, but even within our tiny little faith group of the Church of Christ, we can see this happen. We argue with each other about small things from time to time, and we get into these arguments. And not only does that affect people outside of the church, but it affects people inside of the church. People are voting with their feet right now. They're leaving the church, and a lot of those are our youth. So, if we're not full of grace and the love of Jesus, that becomes a much more powerful message than any words that we can get to come out of our mouth. We have to practice what we preach. We have to be able to show that. And the Christian world is struggling with this. I just tell you, I believe that the Christian world is really struggling with this. Right now, the Christian world is too happy to spend time with condemning people to hell than telling people how they can get off that road going to hell. And so that's tough. Now, truth is truth, and we can't get around truth, right? But there is a loving way to deliver truth, and unfortunately, in the Christian world, we don't do that well right now. So that's something that we could work on. The second thing we can work on is we need to be able to bear each other's burdens. All right, so there's two parts to this, bearing each other's burdens. The first part is that, well, first of all, I'll just give you an example. Okay, so I walk into church on Sunday morning, and I see Curtis. Curtis, hi, how you doing? How was your week?
Great.
What's the answer? There it is. Great. Every week is always great at the church, right? Because by Sunday morning, that's all we ever say. It was great. In the meantime, Curtis's car broke down on the way to work, so he was late to work. He got fired because he was late to work, and then when he was walking home with his one small box that he was allowed to take home with him, he got mugged and they took his whole box. But when he showed up on Sunday morning, he was great, right? So I know that's overly dramatic, right? It's overly dramatic, but that's the way we are. This individualistic society, if we're not Superman or Superwoman, we feel like we're a failure, but that's not the way church is supposed to work. With church, we're supposed to show up and we're supposed to share what really happened in our lives that week, and if it was bad, we're supposed to get the help that we need, right? That's the way the church is supposed to work. So not only bearing with each other, but we also need to be able to serve each other. And this is how we're going to reach out and save the lost, all right? There are so many examples within our congregation here of ways that we serve each other. Okay, we've got Simple House, we've got Lord's Diner, we've got the Overflow Shelter, we've got Franklin Elementary. We've got all of these different ways that we can serve outside, but it's also inside the church. And that's why last week I mentioned, I know that within this church, there's not a shirt on a back that wouldn't come off if somebody needed something, that we are able to serve each other in that way. All right, so these are some ideas of things that we need to do better. Once again, if we really focus on one, this whole idea of love and how we are sharing our love, that's probably the most important one that I can say that we need to be doing. All right, now I will tell you that we are starting in a hole. Okay, we are starting in a hole because of the way the world looks at the church today. Because when one congregation or one faith group gets it wrong, everybody else gets painted with a broad brush, right? And so we're all wrong, okay? So I'm throwing Christianity out because something happened, all right? I will tell you this is one reason why I personally really don't like the way that we have seemed to combine religion and politics lately, right? So religion and politics, they should be apart, right? It doesn't mean that you can't have politics, but unfortunately what I see are things like on social media, I see people that will spend hours and hours writing responses and then arguing and then writing responses to responses and arguing and all of it saying, it's because I'm a Christian that I can say this, right? That seems to be their whole thing. And so everybody just fights, and at the end of the day, we can't figure out who the true Christian is because both camps are saying they're Christian, and all they're doing is arguing. And so that's the face that we're presenting to the world as Christian. In Christianity are these arguments, and instead of love for each other, that's what they say. That's what they see. It's just a breeding ground for being termed the H word, hypocrite, right? That is the favorite word of the world to use against the church. Because the world has set us up. They've set us up by claiming that unless we're perfect, we can't be Christ followers. And nobody knows how big of a lie that is more so than us in this room here today, right? Nobody's perfect. But this is the trap that the world has set for us, right? And I will just tell you that the only antidote for any of that is the love that we show each other and that we show the world. So that even if we do make mistakes, that if we are loving just as much as Jesus did, that it will somehow be able to cover that up and that we will be able to bring the message that we need to bring to the world. All right, so how did the telling of your conversion story go? So this is where we need to start. If we can't explain why Jesus is important to us and why we want to be a part of Jesus' church, it's hard to fire up other disciples down the road, right, to do the same thing. It's hard to do that, right? If we can do this, if we can do the things that we're talking about here, then we just start small. We have to start small because we have to overcome this momentum. I mean, turning the Titanic takes forever. I went to a lecture one time, and it was an SR-71 pilot. It takes 4 states to turn the SR-71 around in a 180-degree turn because it's going so fast. That's what we have to overcome. We're going so fast in one direction, it's going to take us a while to get things turned around and go the opposite direction. So we need to start small, and we need to be able to share our story to start small. And if we can do that, we can become the church that Jesus wants of us, right? So, the second question I had you discuss today was why you stay in the church, why you've continued to follow Jesus. Because obviously there are wrong reasons. If you're here because you're scared, or if you're here because somebody made you come here, those are wrong reasons to be here, right? But if what we are truly doing here is that we are committed into living like Jesus and working as the church that Jesus wanted for us, then we can probably flip this downward trajectory that we're seeing in the Christian church. But in order to do that, we need to be willing workers in the field. We need to be able to get out there. We need to start planting seeds, and we need to be building disciples. We need to be showing Jesus to the world. Now, once again, putting people in the auditorium is not our goal. The goal is to show Jesus to the world, and by doing that, the logical outcome of that is that people want to join the church and they want to be here. So that's what we want to do that. And if we do that, then we can stop talking about how the church is supposed to be so much more, and the church will actually become so much more. All right, so just want to say thanks for the last couple weeks and for everybody coming back this week after last week. And I hope you have a great week. Love you all. And that's it for today. Thank you.